In 1913, Henry Ford discovered a tiny piece of Canadian steel that was about to change the speed of global manufacturing. It was a cold-formed, square-drive fastener manufactured in a small brick factory in Milton, Ontario. At the time, Ford was building his automotive empire. Every second on the assembly line cost money. When Ford engineers tested this new Canadian screw, they realized the square recess stopped the screwdriver from slipping. It allowed workers to drive screws blind, with one hand, at unprecedented angles. It saved the Ford Motor Company exactly 2 hours of assembly time per vehicle. Ford recognized the mechanical superiority immediately. He approached the inventor, a former salesman named Peter Lymburner Robertson, with a proposition. Ford wanted the screw. He wanted exclusive rights. He wanted to dictate the manufacturing terms, the licensing, and total control over where the fasteners went. Robertson refused. He refused to hand over his patents. He refused to cede control of his Milton factory to American industrial demands. He walked away from the most lucrative manufacturing contract in the history of the early automotive industry. That single refusal fundamentally fractured the North American hardware market. It created a strange, enduring industrial paradox. To this day, the United States relies heavily on a universally frustrating, cam-out-prone crosshead design. But cross the northern border into Canada, and you will find an entirely different mechanical reality. In Canadian garages, on Canadian construction sites, and inside Canadian manufacturing plants, the Robertson square drive screw achieved absolute dominance. It became the unofficial fastener of an entire nation. But the cost of that national dominance was international obscurity and the eventual dismantling of the very factory that brought it into existence. Welcome to Fallen Canadian Tool Empires. We document the brilliant designs, the silent factories, and the forgotten hardware that once built this nation. If you want to understand why the tools in your workbench disappeared, subscribe to the channel. Now let us return to the exact moment Peter Robertson realized the shape of the future. The year was 1907. Peter Lymburner Robertson, a traveling salesman born in Seneca Township, Ontario, was standing in a workshop demonstrating a new spring-loaded screwdriver. He positioned the tool. He applied downward pressure. Without warning, the flat blade slipped violently from the shallow slot of the screw head. The steel plunged directly into his hand. The cut was deep. The bleeding was immediate. Robertson wrapped his hand, stopped the demonstration, and walked away with a profound mechanical revelation. That single physical wound exposed an industrial bottleneck that was quietly costing North American factories millions of dollars in lost time and damaged goods. Before Robertson filed his patents, the Canadian hardware landscape was entirely dominated by a single, fundamentally flawed fastener, the slotted screw. By the early 20th century, Canadian manufacturing was accelerating. Foundries in Hamilton were pouring steel. Furniture makers in southern Ontario were turning out thousands of chairs and cabinets. Boat builders in the Maritimes were assembling vessels at a rapid pace. Yet the entire industrial apparatus was held together by a screw design that had not changed since the 15th century. The slotted screw, or flathead, was cheap to manufacture because a simple saw could cut the groove. But mechanically, it was an absolute failure for high-speed assembly. It required two hands to drive, one to hold the fastener steady and one to turn the driver. The driver blade had no self-centering capability. If a mechanic applied too much torque, the blade cammed out. If a carpenter drove the screw too fast, the flathead stripped. When the blade slipped, it invariably gouged expensive mahogany, scratched finished metal panels, or, as Robertson knew firsthand, injured the worker. The slotted screw dictated the speed of Canadian industry, and that speed was slow. Robertson understood that a square recess provided superior torque transfer. The straight walls of a square hole would trap the driver blade, eliminating side slip entirely. But the concept of an internal drive screw was not actually new. Inventors had drawn square drive screws for decades. The problem was not the geometry. The problem was the metallurgy. The engineering hurdle was manufacturing. To mass produce a screw, factories used a process called cold heading. A machine slammed a steel punch into a cold wire, blank, to form the head. If an inventor tried to punch a deep square hole into cold steel, The immense pressure caused the metal to fracture, or the punch would snap upon withdrawal. Because of this manufacturing impossibility, the square drive screw remained an expensive, custom-machined novelty. It was useless to the massive factories springing up across Canada. Robertson solved the metallurgy problem with a subtle geometric trick. He did not punch a perfect square, he punched a tapered square. By adding a slight chamfer to the corners and a taper to the inner walls of the recess, the cold-heading punch could strike the steel blank and withdraw smoothly without breaking. The taper prevented the steel from fracturing, but it also created an accidental, brilliant side effect. The tapered walls meant that when a matching screwdriver was inserted, the friction wedged the tool and the screw together. A worker could place a screw on the tip of the driver, hold it horizontally, or even point it straight down, and the screw would not fall off. It was a friction fit. For the first time in mechanical history, a screw could be driven entirely blind, with one hand. In 1908, armed with his patented cold-forming technique, Robertson established the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company. He chose Milton, Ontario, a small town west of Toronto. Milton offered crucial advantages: proximity to the expanding industrial centers of Ontario, favorable tax conditions, and direct access to railway lines that could distribute heavy kegs of steel fasteners across the country. The early reception in the Canadian market was a mixture of deep skepticism and sudden, absolute conversion. Local hardware stores in Ontario initially resisted. The Robertson screw required the purchase of a new, specialized screwdriver, an irritating barrier to entry for mechanics who already owned standard flathead drivers. But the first industrial buyers quickly realized the economics of the taper. When a cabinet-making shop in Toronto tested the first commercial batches from the Milton factory, the results were undeniable. Workers no longer needed to pre-drill pilot holes with absolute precision. They did not have to stop to inspect gouged wood. The Milton factory produced a fastener that allowed carpenters to sink screws twice as fast. Word spread through the Canadian trades. Electricians discovered they could drive Robertson screws into tight junction boxes with one hand, holding a wire with the other. Plumbers used them in cramped crawl spaces where a slipping slotted driver would mean a bruised knuckles. Within 2 years, the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was pulling in orders faster than the cold-heading machines could punch them out. The Milton factory began expanding. The local workforce swelled. The square drive screw was no longer just an Ontario invention. It was rapidly becoming the foundation of Canadian assembly lines. It represented a distinct departure from traditional toolmaking. It was a precise, unyielding piece of geometry that perfectly suited the cold, pragmatic demands of industrial production. The Canadian tool market had found its perfect fastener, but the true test of the Milton factory would not come from local carpenters or hardware store clerks. It would come from the most ruthless manufacturing environment on Earth, the emerging automotive assembly line. To understand why a simple fastener conquered the Canadian industrial landscape, you have to examine the physical geometry of the tool itself. The Robertson screw was not merely a square hole punched into a metal head. It was a highly engineered, truncated pyramid. The 4 internal walls sloped slightly inward, tapering to a flat bottom. This specific taper was the core technological breakthrough. It provided absolute mechanical certainty. When a worker inserted a Robertson screwdriver into the screw head, the tapered tip wedged tightly against the tapered walls of the recess. This created a friction fit, a temporary mechanical bond between the tool and the fastener. The worker could place the screw on the end of the driver and suspend it in midair. It would not fall. More importantly, the square recess entirely eliminated a destructive physical phenomenon known as cam-out. Cam-out occurs when the rotational force of a screwdriver pushes the blade up and out of the screw head, causing the tool to slip. Slotted screws required constant, heavy downward pressure to prevent cam-out. The Robertson square drive required almost none. The rotational force was captured perfectly by the straight sides of the square. In the early 1910s, this geometric advantage collided with the birth of modern mass production. The defining testing ground was not a small woodworking shop, but the sprawling industrial floors of the automotive industry. Ford Motor Company had established a major manufacturing plant in Walkerville, Ontario, right across the river from Detroit. The Walkerville plant was tasked with assembling the Model T for the Canadian market and the broader British Empire. Automobile manufacturing in this era relied heavily on wood. The frames, the interior paneling, and the structural supports were secured by thousands of individual wood screws. Using slotted screws on a moving assembly line was a slow, hazardous process. Workers constantly stripped the screw heads, requiring them to stop, extract the damaged fastener, and start over. If a flathead driver slipped, it gouged the finished wooden panels, resulting in expensive scrap materials. When the Walkerville Ford plant procured its first bulk orders of Milton-made Robertson screws, the assembly metrics changed overnight. Because of the friction fit, a Canadian assembly line worker could reach into a canvas apron, place a Robertson screw on the tip of his driver, and drive it straight into a wooden chassis frame with one hand. He could drive screws horizontally, vertically, or entirely blind in the dark recesses under the vehicle dashboard. There was no slipping. There was no cam out. The driver stayed locked in the recess until the screw was fully seated. Internal efficiency reports from the Walkerville plant revealed a staggering number. By switching from traditional slotted screws to Robertson square drive screws, the Canadian factory saved exactly 2 hours of assembly time per vehicle. In the high-volume, low-margin world of automotive manufacturing, 2 hours of labor savings per unit was an unprecedented economic triumph. The initial unit cost of a Robertson screw was slightly higher than a slotted screw. The cold-forming process required specialized steel and more precise machinery, but the Canadian price context rendered that initial cost irrelevant. The labor time saved on the factory floor instantly absorbed the higher purchase price. The Fisher Body Company, a massive automotive coach builder operating a facility in Windsor, Ontario, recognized the same mathematics. They adopted the Robertson screw for their wooden car bodies. Stripped screws and ruined wood panels practically disappeared from their production lines. The breakthrough rapidly expanded beyond the automotive sector. The Canadian Pacific Railway, operating out of the massive Angus shops in Montreal, adopted the square drive screw for the construction of their passenger rail cars. Rail cars endured relentless daily vibration. Slotted screws often could not be driven tight enough to withstand the shaking, and they slowly backed out over time. The Robertson drive allowed railway mechanics to apply maximum torque, securing the wooden interiors firmly against the steel frames. In southwestern Ontario, the furniture factories of Stratford abandoned slotted screws in favor of the Milton fasteners. Fine hardwood cabinetry demanded precision. A single slipped flathead driver could destroy a mahogany dresser door. The Robertson screw protected the material, accelerated the cabinet makers, and fundamentally changed the speed of Canadian furniture assembly. Boat builders in the Muskoka region adopted them for marine construction, driving brass Robertson screws deep into wooden hulls where wet hands and tight angles made two-handed fastening impossible. By 1913, the Robertson screw had established a formidable Canadian moat. It was the undisputed standard for high-volume manufacturing across the nation. This absolute dominance caught the attention of Henry Ford himself. Recognizing the 2 hours of saved assembly time at his Canadian facility, Ford sought to implement the Robertson screw across his entire American manufacturing empire. He requested a meeting with P.L. Robertson. The American industrialist presented a ruthless proposition. Ford wanted to use the square drive screw in his Highland Park plant in Michigan, but he demanded total control. He required the right to manufacture the screws himself in the United States, or he demanded exclusive licensing rights that would effectively turn the Milton operation into a captive subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company. Robertson refused. He had recently lost European patent rights due to a bad licensing deal in England, and he was fiercely protective of his remaining control. He refused to hand over his manufacturing independence. He refused to let the Ford Motor Company dictate the future of his invention. Robertson walked away from the negotiation table, withdrew from the American automotive market, and returned to his brick factory in Ontario. Henry Ford ordered his American plants to find another solution. The Walkerville plant in Canada continued using the Robertson screw, but the vast, expanding American automotive industry was firmly shut out. This single refusal drew a hard, permanent boundary line. It sealed the Robertson screw inside the Canadian market. It was a decision that preserved the independence of the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company. It protected the jobs in Milton. It ensured that the square drive screw would become a distinctly Canadian phenomenon. But by locking the American industrial machine out, Robertson unknowingly planted the seeds for his company's eventual systemic isolation. By the early 1930s, the P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company had transformed from a promising local enterprise into the undisputed mechanical heart of Canada. The refusal to surrender to Henry Ford did not destroy Peter Robertson. Instead, the rejection of the American automotive market forced the company to turn inward, conquering every single remaining inch of the Canadian industrial, commercial, and retail landscape. In Milton, the factory expanded into a sprawling, multi-acre brick complex. The rhythmic, deafening thud of massive cold-heading machines echoed across the town 24 hours a day, operating in continuous, unyielding shifts. P.L. Robertson was no longer just a toolmaker. He was the primary economic engine of Milton. The company built houses for its rapidly expanding workforce. It paved the local dirt streets. It funded the construction of the Milton Hospital. The town and the tool factory were inextricably bound together, operating in absolute synchronization to feed a nation's insatiable demand for the square drive fastener. The scale of production reached staggering, unprecedented metrics. The Milton plant was consuming hundreds of tons of raw steel wire every single week. Massive spools of steel were fed into the headers, punched, threaded, heat-treated, and poured into heavy wooden kegs. At its peak, the factory was churning out millions of individual screws every day. Walk into Aikenhead's Hardware in downtown Toronto during the 1940s, and the traditional slotted screw had been relegated to the back shelves, sold mostly to American tourists or for the repair of antique furniture. The prime retail space, the front aisles, and the heavy bulk bins were entirely dominated by the Robertson drive. In Montreal, Pascal Hardware distributed thousands of kegs of Milton fasteners to Quebec construction crews. Western Canadian retailers, supplied by the sprawling transcontinental railway networks, brought the square drive to the booming prairie cities and the expanding logging camps of British Columbia. The true glory of the Robertson Empire was its absolute, unquestioned adoption by the Canadian trades. It was a level of market saturation that most global toolmakers could only dream of achieving. The company introduced a brilliantly simple, color-coded handle system for their screwdrivers that became a permanent part of the Canadian industrial vocabulary. The number 0 driver was yellow, the number 1 was green, the number 2 was red, the number 3 was black. The Canadian electricians standardized entirely on the Robertson. The red-handled number 2 Robertson screwdriver became the mandatory, foundational tool in every electrician's leather pouch. You could not wire a commercial building in Toronto, a factory in Vancouver, or a residential home in Halifax without it. Ontario Hydro and Bell Canada mandated the square drive fastener for their massive infrastructure projects. Electrical junction boxes, switch plates, breaker panels, and heavy conduit brackets across the nation were manufactured exclusively with Milton forged screws. The Canadian carpenter completely abandoned the flathead. During the massive post-war housing boom of the 1950s, framing crews, roofers, and finish carpenters relied heavily on the green-handled number 1 and the red-handled number 2 drivers. When Beaver Lumber supplied the raw materials for hundreds of thousands of new suburban homes across the provinces, the accompanying hardware was stamped in Milton. Plywood subfloors were screwed down with Robertson drives. Kitchen cabinets were hung with Robertson drives. The Canadian marine industry, operating out of the massive naval shipyards in Halifax, and the specialized recreational boat builders in Ontario's cottage country, drove millions of brass and bronze Robertson screws into wet, unforgiving lumber. The friction fit allowed shipwrights to drive fasteners deep into the hulls while hanging off scaffolding over the water. The peak Canadian workshop experience was not defined by the roar of a new power saw, but by the silent, perfectly seated friction fit of a red-handled driver locking flawlessly into a Milton forged screw. This was the zenith of the empire. The square drive screw was not just a highly successful commercial product. It was the absolute defining standard of Canadian hardware. It was an unbreakable mechanical monopoly built on superior geometry. But while the Milton factory pumped out millions of fasteners a day to secure the borders of its Canadian kingdom, a different, deeply flawed industrial standard was quietly conquering the rest of the world. The isolation of the Canadian market was absolute. While the American manufacturing sector grudgingly adopted the Phillips head screw in the 1930s, a design fundamentally engineered to cam out and prevent over-torquing on early, unrefined assembly lines, Canadian industry refused to regress. The Milton factory had already provided a superior solution. The Canadian mechanic did not want a tool designed to fail. They wanted the Robertson. While the American mechanic spent the post-war boom cursing stripped crossheads and drilling out ruined fasteners, the Canadian mechanic worked in rapid, uninterrupted silence. Walk down the hardware aisle of an early Canadian tire store in 1955, and the visual evidence of this victory was overwhelming. Row after row of heavy cardboard boxes, each stamped with the Milton, Ontario manufacturing mark, filled the shelves. The Phillips screw was treated as an unwanted foreign invader, stocked only as a necessary evil for repairing imported American appliances or servicing American cars. The cultural saturation went deep into the educational system. In the technical schools of Ontario and Quebec, vocational instructors did not even bother teaching students how to drive a slotted screw properly. It was considered a dead technology. Apprentices were handed a green number 1 and a red number 2 Robertson driver on their first day. The curriculum was standardized around the square drive. The trade unions demanded them. The construction contractors budgeted for them. The P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was not just producing a fastener. It was holding together the entire physical infrastructure of the Canadian mid-century economic boom. If this company faltered, if this factory closed, Canada would lose the one piece of perfect mechanical logic that separated its workshops from the rest of the world. The scale of this dependency was visible in every sector. The mobile home and trailer manufacturing boom of the early 1950s, centered in small towns across Alberta and Ontario, relied heavily on Robertson fasteners to secure lightweight wood paneling to metal frames. The relentless vibration of a trailer on the newly built Trans-Canada Highway would shake a slotted screw loose within miles. The Robertson, driven tight with its superior torque, held the Canadian road. Furthermore, the Canadian agricultural sector heavily adopted the square drive. Tractor repair shops in Manitoba stocked Robertson machine screws to replace the stripped factory hardware on imported farm equipment. The square recess meant a farmer could clear a screw head packed with hardened prairie mud using a simple nail, and the driver would still engage perfectly. A Phillips head, once filled with debris, was almost impossible to clear and drive in the field. The Robertson was an all-weather, all-condition fastener. The Milton factory was running at maximum capacity. The peak metric of this Canadian dominance was almost incomprehensible. By 1950, the plant was producing billions of square drive fasteners annually. It was estimated that over 80% of all wood and machine screws sold in Canada bore the distinct tapered square recess. The Milton facility had grown into a self-sustaining industrial ecosystem. It was an era when the phrase, "made in Canada," still represented the absolute pinnacle of hand tool engineering. The adoption was so total, so culturally ingrained, that a generation of Canadian tradesmen grew up entirely unaware that the Robertson screw was a local anomaly. A carpenter in Calgary simply assumed that when a builder in Chicago or London reached for a screw, they reached for a Robertson. It was the standard. Nothing else made mechanical sense. But this empire was structurally fragile. The failure to secure the American market with Henry Ford had confined the Robertson screw to a geographical island. P.L. Robertson had built a massive, highly specialized manufacturing machine that relied entirely on the continued loyalty of the Canadian retail and industrial sectors. As long as Robertson was alive, and as long as the Canadian borders remained somewhat protected by trade tariffs and logistical distance, the Milton factory was a fortress. However, the forces of international toolmaking were shifting. The original patents that had protected the precise taper of the Robertson square drive had expired. Giant American hardware corporations were looking north, eyeing the lucrative Canadian retail shelves. They possessed massive economies of scale, producing inferior screws at a fraction of the cost. And inside the red brick walls of the Milton plant, time was running out for the uncompromising founder. In 1951, Peter Lymburner Robertson died at the age of 72. He left behind a thriving industrial town, a universally beloved tool, and a fiercely independent company. But without his absolute stubborn control, The fortress doors were suddenly unlocked. The golden era of the Canadian toolmaking empire had reached its absolute summit. The long, slow, systematic dismantling of the Milton plant was about to begin. In 1951, Peter Lymburner Robertson died at the age of 72. His death was not merely the loss of an inventor, it was the collapse of the most formidable defensive wall surrounding the Milton factory. For over 4 decades, Robertson had governed his company with absolute, uncompromising control. He had refused Henry Ford. He had rejected Wall Street investors. He had denied any engineering concessions that would trade mechanical perfection for short-term profit. But when he died, the sheer force of his stubborn independence vanished. The wealth and control of the company transferred, and the boardroom doors swung open to the very financial forces Robertson had spent his life fighting. The decline of the Canadian square drive empire was not a sudden, fiery collapse. It was a slow, systematic erosion driven by patent expirations, corporate absorption, and the ruthless math of modern retail. In the 1960s, the core patents protecting the precise, tapered geometry of the Robertson recess expired. The perfect mechanical design, which had granted Milton an untouchable monopoly in the Canadian tool market, suddenly became public domain. The legal barrier was gone. Any steel plant in Ohio, any cold-heading facility in Asia, and any multinational corporation had the legal right to manufacture square drive screws. But instead of triggering a war over engineering quality, the market initiated a ruthless race to the bottom in price. In 1968, the independent P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company was acquired by TransUnion Corporation, a massive American industrial conglomerate. This was a fatal systemic turning point. For the first time in history, the future of Canada's defining fastener was no longer decided in Milton. It was dictated by financial analysts in Chicago. The parent corporation did not view the Milton plant as a symbol of Canadian industrial pride. They viewed it as a line item on a ledger. Decisions regarding steel quality, heat treating processes, supply chain management, and labor relations were slowly optimized for quarterly profit margins. The company was no longer shaping the market was reshaping the company. This corporate absorption collided with a massive structural shift in hardware retail. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Robertson's distribution relied on independent hardware stores, regional industrial suppliers, and the Canadian railway network. But moving into the 1970s and 1980s, the rise of massive big-box retail chains shattered that traditional structure. The big-box stores changed the rules. They controlled the aisles, they controlled the shelf space, and most importantly, they demanded catastrophic reductions in wholesale pricing. These retail giants quickly realized a harsh mathematical truth. With the patents expired, they were no longer obligated to buy genuine Milton-stamped boxes. Instead, they began sourcing private label hardware from overseas. A flood of cheap imported square drive screws hit the Canadian market. This influx of foreign hardware dealt a devastating blow to the Milton plant. The imported fasteners were cheaper because they used inferior steel alloys and were produced by cheap labor. More importantly, to save time during the cold-forming process, foreign manufacturers often skipped the delicate, differential taper inside the square recess, the exact geometric detail that created the perfect friction fit. But to the purchasing managers at the big box chains, this loss of mechanical grip was irrelevant compared to the massive profit margins. When a construction contractor bought hundreds of thousands of screws for a housing project in suburban Toronto, a few dollars saved per keg instantly decided the contract. This competitive displacement did more than erode revenue. It eroded the mechanical truth of the tool. Millions of Canadian carpenters, electricians, and mechanics began driving cheap, imported square drive screws, and they noticed the drivers slipping, the corners rounding, and the fasteners failing to hold. They did not know they were using a flawed copy. They just saw a square hole and assumed the quality of Robertson had collapsed. The ultimate symbol of Canadian mechanical perfection was being diluted by its own shape. As contracts were canceled and orders dropped, the once glorious factory began to shrink. The relentless noise of the cold-heading machines was replaced by long periods of silence. Night shifts were canceled. Veteran machinists were laid off. The company acted according to basic survival logic. They sold off assets, they cut costs, and they compromised. But the retreat of the Canadian tool-making empire was only just beginning. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the North American Free Trade Agreement fundamentally altered the Canadian industrial landscape. The border that had once protected Milton became highly porous. Tariffs vanished almost overnight. Multinational hardware corporations saw the Canadian market not as a separate, respected ecosystem, but as a minor northern territory to be flooded with globalized supply chains. The Robertson brand, now entirely stripped of its founder's fierce independence, was traded repeatedly between massive holding companies. It was passed from TransUnion to Marmon Group and eventually absorbed into the massive Infasco and Afas Group conglomerates. Each new corporate owner looked at the aging brick facility in Milton and saw a geographic liability. The raw Canadian steel, once the pride of Hamilton foundries, was becoming too expensive compared to global alternatives. The Canadian unionized labor, which had built generations of middle-class wealth in Ontario, was deemed a massive cost center that needed to be eliminated to satisfy shareholders. Furthermore, the environmental regulations surrounding the heat treating and metal plating processes were tightening across the province. These regulations required millions of dollars in facility upgrades, capital investments that the parent companies simply refused to authorize for an old factory. In contrast, massive manufacturing hubs in Taiwan and mainland China offered cold heading and heat treating at a fraction of the cost. The harsh mathematical reality of globalism left absolutely no room for a localized, highly specialized Canadian tool plant. The parent corporations initiated a systematic, irreversible process of outsourcing the production of the very fastener that had built the town. It happened in stages, almost invisibly at first. The factory began importing raw steel blanks from overseas and only threading them in Milton. Then they outsourced the specialized low-volume fasteners entirely. Finally, the massive high-volume orders for standard residential construction screws were shifted to Asian contractors. Even the iconic color-coded screwdrivers themselves, the legendary green number 1 and the red number 2, were quietly outsourced. The Made in Canada stamp, a physical mark of mechanical guarantee that had defined the tool for 80 years, was quietly erased from the stamped handles. This systemic shift was painfully visible in every Canadian tire, home hardware, and local lumber yard across the nation. The heavy cardboard kegs proudly stamped with Milton, Ontario, vanished from the retail aisles. They were systematically replaced by sleek plastic tubs, imported blister packs, and generic cardboard boxes. The red-handled number 2 driver, the definitive, mandatory tool of the Canadian electrician, lost its substantial, heavy feel. The new plastic handles were injection molded overseas. The steel tips, while still square, lacked the absolute perfect friction fit of the original Milton cold heading process. The mechanics noticed it immediately. The carpenters felt it in their hands. The imported tool slipped just a fraction of a millimeter more. The grip was slightly less certain. When a framer in British Columbia tried to drive one of these new imported screws into dense Douglas fir, the square recess would frequently strip. The imported fasteners lacked the exact differential taper that P.L. Robertson had spent years perfecting. Foreign factories simply punched a straight square hole to save machining time, ignoring the slight, brilliant angle of the inner walls. Without that specific taper, the friction fit was completely destroyed. The screw would fall off the tip of the driver. The worker needed 2 hands again. The fundamental defining advantage of the Robertson system was being erased by cheap manufacturing practices. Yet because the imported box still said square drive, the user blamed the concept, not the execution. The executives in Chicago and overseas did not care about a frustrated framer in British Columbia. They cared entirely about the unit cost. By stripping the manufacturing out of Canada, they maximized the profit margins on a legacy brand. The P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company had been reduced from an innovative engineering pioneer into a hollow distribution shell. They were simply importing metal from Asia, packaging it in a box with a Canadian heritage logo, and selling it to big box retailers. Inside the Milton plant, the corporate dismantling was clinical and entirely devoid of sentiment. The original patents were long dead. The Canadian manufacturing moat was utterly breached. The brand name Robertson survived, but it survived merely as a licensed trademark. The tool company was no longer shaping Canadian industry. It was just a ghost haunting the hardware aisle. The town of Milton, which had grown entirely around the brick walls and the deafening rhythm of P.L. Robertson's vision, was rapidly transforming into a quiet commuter suburb of Toronto. The industrial identity was actively erased. The massive railway spurs that once carried millions of square drive fasteners to the prairies and the Maritimes were paved over, replaced by residential developments and sprawling shopping centers. The local workforce watched the disaster unfold. Generations of families who had built their lives around the continuous rhythm of the headers watched the heavy machines being unbolted from the concrete floors. The massive spools of steel wire stopped arriving. The deafening noise that had defined the town for a century faded away. The company did not fail because its core design was mechanically flawed. It failed because its core design was too easy to copy, and its physical factory was too expensive to operate within the new global retail order. The decline accelerated. Orders fell. Machines stopped. The floor went quiet. The gates were locked. The factory closed. The town moved on. The empire collapsed. Canada lost its factory. The tool remained alone. The P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company no longer exists as an independent, sovereign entity. The corporate structure that bears the name is merely a subsidiary of a massive multinational fastener conglomerate, Pollen, which is in turn absorbed by the sprawling EFAS Group. The vital business decisions are made far from the quiet streets of Milton. The raw steel is no longer poured in Hamilton foundries. The cold heading process, the precise machining of the tapered recess, and the final stamping of the hardware are largely executed by anonymous contractors in massive, overseas industrial zones. The economic empire that Peter Lymburner Robertson built to protect his invention has been entirely dismantled, stripped down, and fed into the ruthless efficiency of the global supply chain. Yet the mechanical logic of his invention refused to die. In an unprecedented defiance of corporate absorption and global retail standardization, the Robertson screw survived. It did not merely survive as a niche specialty item, it survived as the absolute, unquestioned, permanent mechanical standard of an entire nation. Cross the border into the United States today, and the square drive fastener remains an obscure anomaly, relegated to specialized woodworking catalogs and recreational vehicle repair kits. The American public continues to struggle daily with the cam-out, the stripped heads, and the inherent physical frustration of the Phillips system, a design fundamentally engineered for a 1930s assembly line constraint that no longer exists. But cross back into Canada, and you enter an entirely different mechanical reality. The Robertson screw is everywhere. It is an inescapable, foundational element of the Canadian physical environment. Go into any Canadian Tire hardware aisle, walk into any home hardware store, or visit any local lumber yard from Halifax to Victoria, and the visual evidence is overwhelming. The color-coded system, the green number 1, the red number 2, the black number 3, is instantly recognized by every single person who has ever picked up a tool in this country. It is a shared, unspoken national language. The Canadian trades never let it go. The electricians refuse to wire a commercial building with anything else. The carpenters refuse to frame a subfloor without it. The cabinet makers, the boat builders, the maintenance workers, and the weekend garage mechanics implicitly understood the value of the friction fit. They understood the perfect torque. They understood that you could load a red-handled driver with a 2-inch steel screw, reach deep into a dark, cramped wall cavity, and drive it blind, perfectly straight, without a single slip. That physical sensation, that absolute mechanical certainty, was far too valuable to surrender to the cheaper, imported crosshead alternatives. The Canadian enthusiast community, and indeed the entire Canadian public, fiercely protects the Robertson drive not just as a tool, but as a point of distinct cultural pride. It is a quiet, subtle reminder of a time when Canadian engineering successfully defied American industrial dominance. When Canadians watch American home improvement television shows, there is a collective national wince every time an American carpenter is shown pressing their entire body weight against a drill, desperately trying to stop a Phillips bit from camming out and destroying the wood. The Canadian viewer watches, confused, and simply wonders why they do not just use a Robertson. There is a strange, surprising footnote to the technological history of the square drive. In recent decades, the American woodworking community has quietly begun adopting the square drive fastener for high-end cabinetry and specialized joinery, most notably through the massive popularity of pocket hole jig systems. These modern systems require a screw to be driven at a steep, awkward angle deep inside a narrow wooden channel. A slotted screw is impossible. A Phillips screw instantly strips. The only geometric design that can handle the extreme torque and the blind angle without camming out is the square drive. Over a century after Henry Ford rejected the Milton factory, American carpenters are finally rediscovering the exact mechanical truth that Peter Robertson proved in 1908. He was right. He was always right, but he lost the empire to prove it. Today, the physical site of the original P.L. Robertson Manufacturing Company tells the final, quiet story of Canadian industrial decline. The massive brick structures on Bronte Street in Milton, Ontario, where thousands of workers once produced billions of fasteners, no longer echo with the deafening thunder of the cold-heading machines. The heavy wooden doors are closed. The railway spurs are gone. The town itself has been absorbed into the sprawling commuter belt of the Greater Toronto Area. The factory buildings that survive have been repurposed, divided up into commercial office spaces, local businesses, and quiet warehouses. The industrial heart of Milton has permanently stopped beating. The story of the Robertson screw is the ultimate Canadian industrial paradox. It was an engineering triumph of the highest order. It solved a fundamental mechanical problem perfectly. It secured the infrastructure of an entire nation. But because of one stubborn refusal and the relentless, crushing weight of global retail economics, the company that built it could not survive. It won the war of technology, but it lost the war of capitalism. We are left with a tool completely divorced from its origins. The factory is silent, the founder is gone, and the empire of steel has vanished. But the perfect geometry remains. Somewhere in a cold, unheated garage in rural Ontario, an old, heavily scarred wooden workbench sits quietly in the shadows. Resting on the battered surface is a worn, perfectly tapered brass square drive screw, waiting silently next to a faded, heavy-handled red screwdriver. See you in the next one.